We'll do it all, everything on our own.
The Holocaust is one of the most horrible events in human history. It occurred during World War II when Hitler was leader of Germany and believed strongly in anti-Semitism, a hate for the Jewish people. Around 6 million Jewish people were murdered by the Nazis. This included as many as 1 million Jewish children.
If I lay here,
However, not all Nazis were German, and not all Germans were Nazis.
would you lie with me and just forget the world?
Millions of other people that Hitler didn't like were killed as well. This included Polish people, Catholics, ethnic groups, handicapped, and homosexuals, along with many others. It is thought that the Nazis murdered as many as over 10 million people. Hitler hated the Jewish people and blamed them for Germany losing World War I. He considered the Jewish people to be less than human. Hitler also believed in the Aryan race, or the master race, consisting of Northern Europeans, especially Germans. This was the blonde hair and blue-eyed race, the people he saw as perfect, even though he had dark hair and brown eyes.
If I lay here, if I just lay here, would you lie with me and just forget the world?
Hitler wrote in his book Mein Kampf that when he would become ruler, he would rid Germany of all the Jews. Not many people believed he would really do this, but as soon as he became Chancellor, he started his work against the Jews. He made laws that said that the Jews had no rights. Then he organised attacks. On November 9, 1938, many Jewish homes and businesses were burnt down or vandalised. This night was called Night of Broken Glass. During World War II, when the Nazis would take over a city in Europe, they would force all the Jewish people into one area of town. This area was called a ghetto and was fenced in with barbed wire and heavily guarded. There was little food, water, or medicine available. It was also very crowded, with multiple families sometimes sharing a single room to live in. As Hitler began to rise in power, he introduced laws and new government policies. Adolf Hitler had the idea of putting all the people he saw undesirable for his empire to be put onto a boat and sent to the island of Madagascar off of Africa. But as he began to expand his empire, he realised that this idea was not achievable, and he needed somewhere to put these people and keep them out of his way. The solution was concentration camps.
If I lay here, if I just lay here, would you lie with me and just forget the world?
Concentration camps were first set up in 1933, and initially their purpose was to hold the so-called undesirable people and political opponents of the Nazis. However, some families with children were also detained in these camps. Although the main purpose of the camps was not to kill people, many died because their health was neglected or they were treated brutally. In all the camps, the detainees were dehumanized and treated as mere objects. The Nazis also built 6 camps with the purpose of carrying out mass murder. All of the camps were based in Poland, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, a name that brought fear to all the Holocaust victims of Europe. The Nazis' collection of their victims for labour and extermination often required excellent organisation and a complex system of transportation. Victims were rounded up often by force and told to report to a certain place, bringing only a small amount of food and some clothing. They did not know where they would be going or what would happen to them, but they were told they were going to a better place. Prisoners of labour camps had all their belongings taken away. Money, valuables and sentimental items such as eyeglasses were confiscated. Valuables were sold to make money for Germany, such as wedding rings taken from a woman given to them by a husband who they would unlikely ever see again.
I couldn't say no.
In most camps, uniforms were standard. Men wore a striped jacket, pants and a hat. Women wore a dress and a headscarf made of the same material. There was no underwear and they would have to wear wooden clogs, which caused blisters. The uniform had to be worn day and night.
You sighed and I was lost in you. Weeks could have passed for all I knew.
Not only that, but prisoners each had a number, which was sewn onto their uniform or tattooed onto their skin. Guards and other officials called prisoners by their numbers and not by their names. Other cloth badges were also used to identify where a prisoner came from and why the Nazis selected them for a camp. An example is a yellow star to represent the Jewish faith, or a purple-coloured triangle for the gay community. An inmate could have at least 2 symbols, but could have more than 6. When victims arrived, they were selected for work or for death. 2 lines were formed. The line with the middle-aged victims were sent to work. The other line of women and children, elderly and disabled, was selected for death. Families were split up and never seen again.
But they weren't there beneath your stare, and they weren't stripped till they were bare of any bindings from the world outside that room.
The squalid conditions and brutality of the guards made life in the camps a degrading and dehumanizing experience. Extermination camps were filled with sights, sounds and smells of people dying, and the remaining inmates lived in constant fear of being killed. The captors saw their victims as increasingly inhuman, which made it easier to kill them. More and more people died in horrific circumstances. Camps were originally intended to imprison the people that the Nazis most despised. But when World War II began, the purpose of the camps changed to forced labour and outright murder.
Preconceived ideas were blown away, so I couldn't say no.
By 1942, extermination through work was the official policy, and all prisoners in the concentration camps were quite literally worked to death. Some victims were also sent for experimental purposes. IG Farber was a powerful group of German chemical companies and was the biggest donor to Hitler's election campaign. They collaborated a lot with the Nazis through the Holocaust. Experiments included using twins for genetic experiments, by injecting coloured dye into their eyes to change their colour and fit in with the race that Hitler wanted to create. Around 3,000 twins were used for this painful genetic experiment, and only about 200 of them survived. Some camps even had gas chambers. When camps began to reach full capacity, people would be led into the chambers in large groups. Some of these rooms were disguised as huge shower rooms, where victims would have to dispose of their clothes before entering. When the chamber doors were sealed, the chemical known as Zyklon B was dropped through an opening in the ceiling. The guards could watch through a window, seeing victims dying and hearing their screams. Prisoners were forced to bury the corpses or burn them in ovens and dispose of their ashes by burying them in cremation pits outside or scattering them on nearby gardens and rivers. Sometimes the ovens broke down or could not keep up with the volume of corpses. In the summer of 1944, 20,000 people were being gassed each day. Many Jewish people, however, hid from the Nazis during World War II. They would hide with non-Jewish families. Sometimes they would pretend to be a part of that family, and sometimes they would hide in hidden rooms or in a basement or attic. Some were able to eventually escape across the border into a free country, but many hid for years, sometimes in the same room. The governments of most countries did very little to rescue victims of Nazism by helping the victims to escape or give them refuge. When they did offer sanctuary, it was often to people who had useful skills or were famous for their talent. But some governments, organisations and individuals showed compassion by reaching out to the victims, saving many lives.
If I could tell the world just one thing, it would be that we're all okay.
Many Jews were saved by non-Jewish and individual groups who saw the people as human beings with a right to life, even though these non-Jews risked punishment and possible death if caught by the Nazis.
Won't be idle with despair.
In addition to courage and compassion, they showed support by not accepting Nazi beliefs about the Jews and came up with ways to help. The Jews would call them the righteous among the nations, and everyone can take inspiration from their love and moral courage.
They are my own, but they're not yours. They are my own, and I am never broken.
As a member of the Nazi Party, Oskar Schindler often socialized with top-ranking Nazis and was able to bribe and persuade them that he needed Jews for his factories in Poland. His wife Emily sold her jewelry to buy medicine and looked after the sick in the clinic she had set up. The couple saved over 1,200 people. The movie Schindler's List tells the story of Oskar Schindler.
We'll fight, not out of spite, 'cause someone must stand up for what's right.
The Zgoda was a Polish underground organization of Jews and non-Jews who saved around 6,000 people. Irene Sandler smuggled Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto in body bags so that the Nazis would think that they were corpses. When Jewish children changed their names, she had them write their real names down and put them into a jar. She buried it for later.
In the end, only kindness matters. In the end, only kindness matters.
Corrie ten Boom was a Dutch lady who helped hide the Jewish people from the Nazis. Corrie got caught by a spy and was sent to a concentration camp. She survived the camp and was let free at the end of the war. But one of the most acclaimed stories from the Holocaust is that of Anne Frank.
I will get down on my knees. I will pray.
Anne Frank was born in Frankfurt, Germany on June 12, 1929, to Edith and Otto Frank. Less than 4 years later, in January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and he and his Nazi government instituted a series of measures aimed at persecuting Germany's Jewish citizens. In early July 1942, Anne's sister Margot Frank received a letter ordering her to report to a work camp in Germany. Anne Frank's family then went into hiding in an attic apartment behind Otto Frank's business, located in Amsterdam. In an effort to avoid detection, the family left a false trail suggesting they had fled to Switzerland. A week after they had gone into hiding, the Franks were joined by Otto's business associate Hermann van Pels, along with his wife August and their son Peter, who were also Jewish. A small group of Otto Frank's employees, including his Austrian-born secretary, risked their own lives to smuggle food, supplies, and the news of the outside world into the secret apartment, whose entrance was situated behind a movable bookcase. In November 1942, the Franks and Van Pels were joined by Fritz Pfeiffer, a Jewish dentist. Life for the 8 people in the small apartment, which Anne Frank referred to as the secret annex, was tense. The group lived in constant fear of being discovered and could never go outside. They had to remain quiet during daytime in order to avoid detection by the people working in the warehouse below. Anne passed the time by writing her observations and feelings in a diary that she had received for her 13th birthday, a month before her and her family went into hiding. Addressing her diary entries to an imaginary friend she called Kitty, Anne Frank wrote about life in hiding, including her impressions of the other inhabitants of the secret annex, her feelings of loneliness, and her frustration over the lack of privacy. While she detailed typical teenage issues such as crushes on boys, arguments with her mother, and resentments towards her sister, Frank also displayed keen insight and maturity when she wrote about the war, humanity, and her own identity. She also penned down short stories and essays during her time in hiding. On August 4, 1944, after 25 months in hiding, Anne Frank and the 7 others in the secret annex were discovered by the Gestapo, the German secret state police, who had learned about the hiding place from a tipster who has never been identified. After their arrest, the Franks, Van Pels, and Mr. Pfeiffer were sent by the Gestapo to Westerbork, a holding camp in the northern Netherlands. From there, in September 1944, the group was transported by freight train to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the extermination and concentration camp complex in German-occupied Poland. Anne and Margot Frank were spared immediate death in Auschwitz gas chambers and instead were sent to a concentration camp in northern Germany. In early 1945, Anne and Margot died of typhus, and their bodies were thrown into a mass grave. Several weeks later, on April 15, 1945, British forces liberated that camp. Edith Frank died of starvation at Auschwitz in January 1945. Hermann van Pell died in the gas chamber at Auschwitz soon after his arrival there in 1944. His wife is believed to have likely died at a concentration camp in what is now the Czech Republic in the spring of that same year. Peter van Pell died at Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, May 1945. Mr. Pfeiffer died from illness in late December 1944. Anne Frank's father, Otto, was the only member of the group to survive. He was liberated from Auschwitz by Soviet troops on January 27, 1945. When Otto Frank returned to Amsterdam following his release from Auschwitz, his former Austrian secretary gave him 5 notebooks and some 300 loose papers containing Anne's writing. She had recovered the materials from the secret annex shortly after the Franks were arrested by the Nazis and had them hidden in her desk. Margot also kept a diary, but that has never been found. Otto Frank knew that Anne wanted to become an author or journalist and had hoped her wartime writings would one day be published. Anne had been inspired to keep a diary after hearing in March 1944 a radio broadcast from an exiled Dutch government official who urged the people to keep journals and letters that would help provide a record of what life was like under the Nazis. After his daughter's writings were returned to him, Otto Frank helped compile them into a manuscript that was published in the Netherlands in 1947 under the title Rear Annex. Anne Frank's diary of her family's time in hiding has been translated into almost 70 languages and is one of the most widely read accounts of the Holocaust. During the last months of the Holocaust, the conditions of the camps got worse and the Nazis treated their victims more brutally. The Holocaust officially ended in 1945, when the Allies of war, made up with Britain, France, USA and the Soviet Union, liberated concentration camps. The Nazis, however, were careful to conceal as much information as they could. Although the Allies were partly aware of what was happening, they did not make this known to the public, because of the rules surrounding the official secrets. But with the war over, problems with health and hygiene persisted. There were also questions as to where the survivors would go, whether they could be reunited with loved ones, and how they could rebuild their lives. The world had never faced such a complex and large-scale crisis as the Holocaust. The Allies had to cope with tragedy while still fighting the war. Military and relief agencies played an important role in the immediate task of rescuing survivors and controlling the spread of disease. Liberators would also collect evidence to be used in the trials of Nazi war criminals. The number of committees and institutions affected in the Holocaust is fairly easy to count, but the effect of their loss is hard to measure. Figures like 10 million people killed, including 6 million Jews, are often quoted. In truth, the exact number may never be known because so much evidence was lost. Hitler, for example, burned his papers before he committed suicide. There are countless victims of the Holocaust whose stories may be lost forever. In many parts of the world, especially in Europe, they have sculptures and installations that have been erected to commemorate the Holocaust. Auschwitz is now a World Heritage Site along with many other former camps, converted into memorial sites and Holocaust museums. They capture the experience of the Holocaust, remembering the lives lost, and prompt lessons to be learned from it, to understand what happened and why. This is in hope that such an event will never happen again.